So the Rebbe, or Lubavitcher Rebbe, whose birthday it is this evening, was the unique Jewish leader of the 20th century, and his leadership and impact, his teachings and his inspiration continue to inspire and impact communities and individuals, Jews and non-Jews, the world over. The book Rebbe manages to capture and communicate much of the Rebbe's unique perspective. So it was with much pleasure that I asked Joseph Telushkin, or Reb Yosef, to share his thoughts. Thank you very much.
Hi,
Take
this
it away.
is. I am very to be here with you, and on this, the Rebbe's birthday. And what I set out to do in my book was to tell the story of what's happened with Chabad, which I really do regard as the most dynamic religious movement within Judaism during the past hundreds of years. When Menachem Mendel Schneerson assumed leadership of Chabad in 1951, it was a relatively small movement headquartered in one neighborhood in Brooklyn, Crown Heights. Yet he had a vision even then. And as far as I know, nobody else had this vision. He wanted to inaugurate the first attempt in Jewish history to reach every Jewish community in the world, and actually every Jew in the world. I don't think that it was a coincidence that this all happened in the aftermath of the Holocaust. As Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, Zichrono Livracha, put it, he said, if the Nazis wanted to hunt down every Jew in hate, the Rebbe wanted to find and hunt every Jew in love. This is a remarkable achievement, what has been accomplished. There are now Chabad houses in all 50 states of the United States. There are now Chabad houses in over 100 countries. Do any of you happen to know where the largest, by the way, can I be heard well? Is everything clear?
You can be heard, but nobody else can speak. They can just nod and wave and sing.
Okay, fine.
So you're going to have to, if you want questions, you'll get it in the chat. But we're yeah.
Okay, so you know what? I'll get a gallery view, so at least I'll get a sense of people's facial reactions. At least I'm seeing more of you now. The largest Seder in the world is held each year in Kathmandu in Nepal, where a lot of Israeli backpackers, a lot of young Israelis after they finish the army in Israel, go there. And they've had as many as 11 or 1,200 people. Now think about it. When Chabad started, I don't think there had been a single Chabadnik in the world who had ever been in Nepal, who knew about Kathmandu. My friend Dennis Prager spent a Shabbat in Phnom Penh, Cambodia, at the house of the Chabad Shliach there, with 15 Jews from 10 different countries. Chabad has impacted the other movements in Judaism, even some movements that we'd think of as being far removed from them. Rabbi Eric Yaffe, who was a longtime president of the Union of Reform Judaism in the United States, said a number of years ago, it is hard for me to say this, but I will say it nonetheless. We must follow the example of Chabad. What I set out to do in the book is not really focus so much on the first half of the Rebbe's life, but what most interested and enchanted me was the second half, the period of time during which he was the leader of Chabad. And it's because that's when we see the full range of his impact and effect. Also, perhaps because he was living in a society like the United States, or it could be in contemporary Europe as well, his impact was not only limited to Jews. There's a remarkable story I uncovered while I was doing the research for my book. In 1968, a Black woman named Shirley Chisholm became the first black woman who was ever elected to the House of Representatives, to Congress in the United States. At that time, a lot of power in Congress was still in the hands of Southern Democrats who would serve in Congress often for 40 years and had a lot of seniority control. And so they took this woman, Shirley Chisholm, who came from the area of Bedford-Stuyvesant and part of Crown Heights. She was actually also the Rebbe's congresswoman. And she wanted to do work in labor and education. And they put her on the Agriculture Committee, leading a newspaper in New York to headline what they had done to her, a tree grows in Brooklyn. Obviously, this woman coming from a poor neighborhood in Brooklyn didn't want to be on the Agriculture Committee, and she was very unhappy. And Rabbi Chodakov, who was then the Rebbe's, and was for very many years, the Rebbe's chief aide, called her up and said, the Rebbe would like to meet you. Chisholm had met the Rebbe before. Basically, all politicians running in the New York area at one point or another would go to the Rebbe and get a bracha. Obviously, the Rebbe was not going to start endorsing individuals for office. And the Rebbe meets with her and says, I understand you're very upset. And she said, I'm upset, I'm angry, I'm humiliated. I want to work for the people who voted me in there. I want to do work in education. I want to do work in labor. I want to help my people. And the Rebbe said, what a blessing God has given you. They put you on the Agriculture Committee. This country has so much surplus food, and there are so many hungry people, and you can use this gift that God's given you to help feed hungry people. Just find a creative way to do it. She found in those days, on her first day in Congress, a Republican congressman named Robert Dole from Kansas, which had a lot of farmers who needed help. And in those days in the United States, Democrats and Republicans could actually sometimes work together. I say that because now it's becoming very, very hard, and this is a bad thing for a society. Anyway, Chisholm plays a critical role in expanding food stamps, giving poorer Americans access to food. The story of her being inspired by the Rebbe was not known until 15 years later, when she was getting ready to retire from Congress, and they made a big breakfast to honor her. And at that breakfast, she told the whole story of what the Rebbe had said to her. Just find a creative way to do it. What you see as an insult is actually a challenge God has given you. And she then concluded her comments by saying, a rabbi who is an optimist taught me that what you think is a challenge is actually a gift from God. And then she said, if poor babies have milk and poor children have food, it's because this rabbi in Crown Heights had vision. Right away, we realize we're dealing with a different sort of figure, a person who was able to have an enormous impact on his own community, but also reach out and have a profound impact on a broader community. There were a couple of key moves that the Rebbe made and that were innovative to the Rebbe. One was the whole concept of a big network of shluchim, sending out emissaries all over the world. As a general rule, the tendency in the Orthodox world, and this applies to Misnagdim, and this applies to Hasidim, in most of the Orthodox world, the tendency is to want to make sure that people continue to live within an Orthodox community. There is a great fear that if people are sent out to a broader world, that world will affect them more than they will affect that world, and they'll be lost. The Rebbe had confidence that he could send out his shluchim, even into communities where there are very, very few other fully observant Jews. And as a result, the Rebbe had emissaries all over the world. And aligned to that were the campaign of mitzvot, a whole series of campaigns that the Rebbe conducted to make certain mitzvot, commandments that were largely ignored suddenly practiced widely again. I'll give you an example of two of his famous campaigns. One was the tefillin campaign. By and large, tefillin, of course, are, I could say what they're called in English, but nobody really knows that word, phylacteries. Tefillin are what a Jewish man, is commanded to put on his arm and on his head each morning when he prays. Outside of the Orthodox world, few Jews observed it. There were some Jews in the conservative movement, and certainly when a boy had a bar mitzvah, he would be given tefillin, but people by and large were not consistent in observing it, and in other communities it was even less so. So what did the Rebbe do? He had a group of people who would go out in New York. It was also done elsewhere, but in New York, and they would stop people on the street and they would say, if it was a man, are you Jewish? If it was a woman, and I'll explain what the campaign was for women in a minute. And if you're a woman, are you Jewish? And if the man answered yes, they would ask him, have you put on tefillin? More often than not, the man would say no. And they would ask the woman, in the case of women, did you light Shabbat candles this past Friday night? And if the woman said no, they would give her a candle, they would give her a candle holder and a little document explaining how the mitzvah is done. In the case of men, they would lead them over to what they called a mitzvah tank, and they would put tefillin on and enable them to say the bracha. Needless to say, many Jews were very uncomfortable with this campaign. For one thing, and I'm sure it's the same thing in Europe, maybe even more so, Jews by and large don't like somebody stopping them on the street and saying, are you Jewish? Because we know that that's been a question that's often been asked by people who are not great friends and admirers of ours. And so many secular Jews, non-observant Jews, were bothered by this campaign. But strangely enough, even within the Orthodox world, there were people who opposed the campaign. They didn't like the idea that utterly non-observant Jews were going to put on tefillin, and who knows, they put on tefillin, let's say, and they would say the Shema, and then they take off the tefillin and go into a restaurant, and for all, could get ham and eggs. And they felt it had no value. One of the distinctive features of the Rebbe was each mitzvah had value in and of itself. Obviously, ideally, the Rebbe hoped that people who put on tefillin would also eventually come and observe kashrut. But each mitzvah had its own value. There's a famous Chinese proverb, a journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step. The Rebbe understood that any mitzvah could be that step that leads someone to a level of greater observance. I used to always compare the Rebbe's approach to that Chinese proverb. But the more I was working on my research on the book, the more I realized there was also a critical difference between the Rebbe's approach and that Chinese proverb. The proverb, a journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step, suggests that every step has importance because it's part of that journey of 1,000 miles. The Rebbe's approach was a little different. Every step has value in and of itself, even if it doesn't culminate in the 1,000-mile journey. So the Rebbe elevated every mitzvah that one could perform as being valuable. To many of us, perhaps this sounds self-evident, but certainly at the time when the Rebbe was pushing this campaign in the late 60s and then very much so in the 70s, a lot of people felt, no, it all had to go together. Either you had to be fully observant or not. In the case of women, what the Rebbe was pushing very much was the candle lighting, which obviously occurs on Friday evening before Shabbat, and of course on all the biblically ordained Jewish holidays. And there the Rebbe was pushing the candles very much. It occurred to me, and I'm sure this was also in the Rebbe's head, what was the great value if suddenly you got a man to start putting on tefillin and a woman to start lighting candles? It meant that 7 days a week, people were doing something distinctively Jewish that could connect them also to God and to Judaism and to Jews all over the world. That was, I think, a very, very important feature of it, because guess what? Tefillin are not put on Jewish holidays, and candles are not lit outside for ritual purposes, other than the Hanukkah candles. Candles are generally also only lit for the holiday. So it meant that something was going on all 7 days. The Rebbe was very willing to use modernity to help promote these things and to promote them through secular sources. I'll give you an example of what I mean. There was a period of time for quite a number of years when every Friday a little classified ad would appear on the front page of the New York Times, which is obviously considered the most prestigious newspaper in the United States. And it would say, Jewish women and girls, candle lighting tonight is at 5:18 p.m. I remember during those years, I started to say, I got mixed up for a second. During those years, that was the only ad that the New York Times ever had on its front page. I'll tell you a funny story, but a very revealing story. Sometimes things are funny, but they don't reveal a big truth. In this case, it's a funny story and reveals a big truth. On January 1st, 2000, the New York Times published a special edition. After all, January 1st, 2000 was the beginning in the Western culture of a new millennium. So they published a special edition. They had the regular news page for January 1st, 2000. Then they reprinted the front page of the New York Times from January 1st, 1900. And then in an act of great speculation, they also printed the front page, a projected front page of the New York Times for January 1st, 2100. A lot of the articles there actually were a little upsetting. You didn't know what the world seemed so different. All of a sudden, can robots vote in elections? A whole bunch of frightening things. But there, smack in the middle of the page, was a little classified ad, Jewish women and girls. Candle lighting tonight is at, 5:18. The shul I go to, a small modern Orthodox shul on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, one of the people who sits next to me in shul, at least before the COVID, but one of the people who sits next to me in shul is my friend Ari Goldman. Ari was a reporter for 20 years on the New York Times, and he was actually hired by the Times with the proviso that he would never have to work on Shabbat or Jewish holidays. Ari told me that it was, I think, an Irish Catholic editor who was given the job of editing the January 1st, 2100 projected front page of the New York Times. Now, it so happens, if you'll check a calendar, you will learn that January 1st, 2100 really is going to fall on a Friday. So this guy called up Chabad, and he actually found out, because we have a fixed Jewish calendar, what time Shabbat was really going to start on January 1st, 2100. I think that story, which is somewhat, humorous, I think it reveals a profound and interesting truth. What I'm going to say now, I know to be true of Jewish life in the United States. I suspect it might well be true of Jewish life in Europe, but you'll be in a better position to answer that than I am. By and large, in the United States, the various religious groups are overwhelmingly supported by members of their group. So if you look, for example, to the funders of the Hebrew Union College Seminary, which is the seminary of Reform rabbis in the United States, I am sure that overwhelmingly they're big donors are people who are affiliated with the Reform movement. The same with the Jewish Theological Seminary and the conservative movement. The same with Yeshiva University. What's striking about Chabad is that so many of the people who contribute to it are not personally affiliated with Chabad, are not people necessarily who are particularly observant. But I think of one thing: they're confident. They are not confident, unfortunately. They are by no means sure that their great-grandchildren are going to identify as Jews. What they are confident of is that on January 1st, 2100, there will be Chabad shluchim going around trying to make sure that Jews light Shabbat candles. And this, I think, is part of what makes for the great success and the emotional support and love really for Chabad. What are some of the principles of the Rebbe's leadership? I want to identify 5 principles of the Rebbe's leadership that I think help bring about the extraordinary success of Chabad that we're aware of. One of them is unconditional love. Love of all Jews, and increasingly the Rebbe also had quite a love of humankind. He didn't have a big love, obviously, of anti-Semites, but he loved humanity, because all of humanity are created b'tselem Elohim, in God's image. He had a particular love, though, within the Jewish community. So on the one hand, one could say, so what's the big chiddush? Why is it? What makes this so special? You know, we all know that the law that appears smack in the middle of the Torah, v'ahavta l'reacha kamocha, love your neighbor as yourself, has always been understood as a law with particular power. Rabbi Akiva said, v'ahavta l'reacha kamocha. Rabbi Akiva, one of the greatest figures of the Talmud, says, love your neighbor as yourself, ze klal gadol b'Torah, which can be translated either as this is a major principle in the Torah or as the major principle in the Torah. Hillel, in a negative formulation, said, the essence of Judaism is what's hateful unto you, don't do unto your neighbor, and the rest is almost like commentary on it. So we know that love was always ordained. Okay, that's true. But the truth is, it wasn't always practiced. The Talmud goes so far as to say that the whole reason the Bayis Sheni, the second temple, was destroyed was because of sinat chinam, because of causeless hatred in the Jewish community. And I'll give you examples of what could happen because of such hatred. In 1232, an inquisition is established in France to root out heresy. And it's established only to root out heresy in the Catholic Church. Yet a group of 3 rabbis, very, very prominent rabbis, go to the Inquisition, and they said there is a heretical writer in the Jewish community that many Jews follow, and his work should also be outlawed and burned. The name of the rabbi against whom they made this claim was Moses Maimonides, Rambam. And they took certain teachings of Maimonides from his book, The Guide to the Perplexed, and from the Sefer Amada, the first volume of the Code of Jewish Law. Once the Inquisition started examining Maimonides' writings, they then started looking at the Talmud. And there were Jews who had converted to Christianity and who became great enemies to the Jewish community, and they would point to passages in the Talmud that could be understood and interpreted as very unfriendly to non-Jews. So what ends up happening is that by 1240, the Inquisition orders that the Talmud should be burned. I think it was something like 2,400 wagon loads. It was some ridiculously large number of Talmuds that were burned. Obviously, the burning of the Talmud would be a trauma at any time that it happened. But can you imagine what a trauma it was in a world where there were no printing presses, where every one of the volumes of the Talmud that was burned had to be handwritten? When that happened, one of the 3 rabbis who had petitioned the Inquisition to go after Maimonides, did tshuva. He repented. In fact, he wrote what remains to this day one of the most important books ever written on tshuva. His name was Rabbi Yonah Gerundi, and he wrote a book called Sharei Tshuva, The Gates of Repentance. It all came about because of that sinah, that hatred that there was too often in the Jewish community. So what does it mean when I say the Rebbe practiced an unconditional love? I'll give you two examples. There was a young rabbi in Israel named Meir Lau. Meir Lau subsequently, years later, became the Rav Harashi, became the chief rabbi of Israel. As a young man, though, he was not a Chabadnik. As a young man, he met with the Rebbe. And the Rebbe, knowing that he was a young rabbi, said to him, "What sort of work are you doing?" And Lau said, "I'm involved in Kiruv Rechokim." Kiruv Rechokim is a Hebrew expression. Let me just check my time again. Is a Hebrew expression that means bringing near those who are far away. It's a sweet term for saying trying to influence non-religious Jews to become religious. The Rebbe didn't like the term. He said to him, "How do we know who's Karov? How do we know who's Rachok? How do we know who's near to God? How do we know who's far? They're all beloved by God." In other words, he didn't want religiously observant Jews to go into the line of work they were doing and trying to influence people, starting from a perspective that they're greater than them. First of all, it's not good for one's own humility. And secondly, it can alienate people. You want people to feel you're all on this road together. A man that I'm friendly with, George Rohr. George and his late father, Sammy, George Lahavdil, should live a long life, were very, very major donors to Chabad. They've played key roles with the Chabads in Russia and in the United States and in other places as well. They played key roles at supporting Chabad on campuses, on university campuses. Unlike many philanthropists who have very, very big Jewish hearts, but might not be Jewishly that knowledgeable, George had a yeshiva background, and he is very knowledgeable. So at the shul that he goes to in the Upper East Side of New York, he started a Minion for Jews who did not have religious background, and the Minion for Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur. As you can imagine, if you walk into a synagogue on Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur, and you basically only go to shul on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, and you don't know Hebrew, and you go into an Orthodox synagogue, you can often feel very overwhelmed. The service is basically all in Hebrew. The rabbi, let's say, might speak in whatever is the local language, in the United States, English, and Holland, Dutch, but nonetheless, you can feel quite out of it. So, and the prayer service is very, very long. So there's a lot to be said. So George, at the Minion that he organized, they did fewer prayers, and he would explain each prayer in advance so that people felt that they understood that which they were praying for. Between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, George went with many others to get a bracha, to get a blessing from the Rebbe, and he was very proud. And he says to the Rebbe, "I want the Rebbe to know that on Rosh Hashanah I conducted a service for Jews with no background, and 180 people came." The Rebbe just stared at him. He did not say anything. He did not smile. He didn't look, so George, the Rebbe, was already quite old. And you know what happens very often when you're speaking to older people, if they don't react to what you're saying, you just repeat it in a much louder voice. So he said again, "I want the Rebbe to know that I had a service for Jews with no background, and 180 people came." And the Rebbe said to him, "What do you mean they had no background? They're the children of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and Leah." Again, he didn't want people to feel that sense of superiority, so to speak, because he saw that inherent holiness in all Jews. Another feature of the Rebbe's love that was very remarkable was in the natural order of events, when somebody is a leader of a movement and the movement is growing in size, they can no longer pay that much attention to individuals. It's sad, but they can't. It just seems to become humanly impossible. The Rebbe always remained, to the extent that he could, focused on individuals. It could take a year to get to meet with him privately and get a bracha and be able to ask him a question. It could take sometimes longer than a year. But if you were persistent enough, you could meet with him. One of the people who had occasion to meet with him more often than that, and the story I'm about to tell you might go far towards explaining how I came to write this book, was my father, Shlomo Telushkin, Zichrono Livracha. And my father was the Rebbe's accountant. Not only was my father the Rebbe's accountant, my father had also been the accountant for the Friedika, for the sixth Rebbe, because my father had been the accountant for Chabad from 1940, when Chabad came to the United States. In 1986, my father had a stroke. Fortunately, he always retained the ability to speak, but it disoriented him. And I always say he was like a man running full speed. My father was 80, but he had been very, very energetic, and he had still been the accountant for Chabad. He's like a man running full speed who runs into a brick wall. Until that time, he used to give a weekly shiur, a weekly class in Talmud. Subsequent to that, he no longer could do so, and he couldn't do his regular accounting work. I was living in Eretz Yisrael at the time. Obviously, I immediately flew back, and my father was in a hospital bed in a coma. And he was unconscious for quite a number of days. Every day we would get 2 phone calls from the Rebbe's office. The Rebbe wants to know how your father is, which was in itself very moving. Then my father comes out of his coma. And a few days later, I get a phone call from Rabbi Yehuda Krinsky, who at that point was the very, very close aide secretary to the Rebbe. And he said, we had a meeting of the leadership this morning, and a question came up on a certain accounting issue. And the Rebbe said, ask Shlomo. When people said, well, Shlomo had a stroke, he's in the hospital, the Rebbe said, ask Shlomo. So obviously, once Rabbi Krinsky told me that, I brought the question to my father, and he really looked at me and gave it an answer. And I thought about the moral imagination of the Rebbe. He's working in his office there at 770 Eastern Parkway. He's dealing with questions that are affecting the whole Jewish world, but he's also thinking about this man who's lying in a hospital bed, who feels his life has come to an end. He didn't want to ask a question to my father that would be so difficult that my father would not be able to answer it and would be exceedingly frustrated, but he didn't want to ask a question that was so simple that it would sound condescending. So he came up with a question that was in the middle, and I realized the depth of goodness and imagination to be able to know what it was that another person needed. This is the sort of love that the Rebbe practiced. There was an imaginative quality to it. I remember a story I heard from Rabbi Shmuel Kaplan, a Chabad shliach in Baltimore now for over 40 years. He was in a kollel, a place where young married students were studying Talmud. And Rabbi Chodakov, again, the Rebbe's age, said, there's a case the Rebbe wants you to work on. It was like a 17-year-old girl who was going through rebellion, but a really serious rebellion, not your normal rebellion against the whole religious lifestyle and in other ways that weren't good. And Kaplan and Chodakov said to Kaplan, anytime you have a question, come to me and I'll ask the Rebbe what to do. Rabbi Kaplan was amazed that the girl would often write letters to the Rebbe and she'd get answers very quickly. And once she was describing the terrible pain, and I suspect all of us here are familiar with the phenomenon. Hopefully it doesn't happen often, but we all know of people in their teenage years and their young 20s who often fall into either very aggressively rebellious moods or very depressed moods, and life seems quite hopeless. And she once wrote a letter to the Rebbe about the great pain she was in. And the Rebbe answered, Ani margish tzarech, I can feel your pain. The answer did not move the girl at all. She thought the Rebbe was being condescending, and she wrote back an angry response. What do you mean that you feel my pain? How can you feel my pain? You don't know me that well. You don't know what I'm going through. Kaplan told me that this time the Rebbe answered within 2 hours. And I'm reading you, obviously, I'm reading you the translation of what the Rebbe wrote, but it's a literal translation. When you will merit to grow up and be married, and God willing have a child, the nature of things are that in the first year, towards the end of the first year, a child begins to teeth, to grow teeth. And the growing of teeth is a painful process, and the child cries as a result. And the mother feels that pain as if it were her own. Kach ani margish tzarech. That is how I feel your pain. Rabbi Kaplan told me that was the first thing that really got through to the girl. That after that, she started to feel that there really was somebody who understood, who wanted to understand, who really did feel her pain. This happened many, many years ago. As when I spoke to Rabbi Kaplan not that long ago, he told me, this girl has long since been a grandmother, but it returned her because of that extraordinary focus on individuals. A second aspect of the Rebbe, he empowered people. He created fearlessness. People who don't know Chabad from the inside sometimes think the Rebbe probably just wanted to be a leader because he seemed to be. That's what he was. Anybody who knows Chabadniks know the level of devotion and admiration they have for the Rebbe. But the Rebbe's goal was not to create people who were just dependent on him. He wanted to create leaders. Literally, the first interview I did when I started the book was with another of the Rebbe's close aides, a man, unfortunately, who died this year from the COVID, Rabbi Label Groner. Groner's first children were identical. I don't remember if they were identical. He had 2 twin sons. And there was a halachic question. The question was, does the mayel, the person performing the circumcision, does he have to make a separate blessing before he circumcises each child, or can he just make the blessing and then circumcise both children one after the other? He came to the Rebbe, and the Rebbe, as a rule, didn't like to answer halachic questions because he didn't want people to then just become on legal questions. He didn't want people to just become dependent on always asking him, and therefore sort of taking power away, from local rabbis. So the Rebbe in this case told Groner, you go back and study the sources. You're a young rabbi. You study the sources and then tell me what conclusion you've come to. Groner did so. And he came back and told the Rebbe his conclusion, and the Rebbe smiled. And the conclusion is the circumciser, does have to make a separate bracha before each person. And the Rebbe smiled and told Groner that that's the conclusion he would have reached. In other words, he wanted to empower him as a leader. When people have that level of respect for a person, as they did for the Rebbe, the problem is they could grow too dependent on that. I came across another instance. There was a rabbi named Rabbi Moshe Yitzchak Hecht. Hecht is a very prominent name within Chabad. But remember this man's name because it's relevant to the story. So Rabbi Moshe Yitzchak Hecht was sent out to New Haven, Connecticut to be a shliach. And like many shluchim, it was hard. Shluchim have hard lives. They have to work hard. And one of the hardest things they have to do is raise enough money, get enough people interested. Hecht finally was in such despair, and we have a copy of it. He wrote the letter he wrote a letter to the Rebbe, and he lays out all of his spiritual problems, all of his political problems, all of his monetary problems, and he appeals to the Rebbe, and he says to the Rebbe, I need you to help me, and I need you to do it all. The Rebbe's response, he expresses no sympathy for Hecht. He just takes the discussion in a different direction. He says, I have already done what you have suggested. I sent to New Haven Rabbi Moshe Yitzchak Hecht. It is apparent from your letter that you don't know this man. You don't know the strengths that this man was given. Try and get to know him now, and everything will change. The mood, the trust in God, the joy. In other words, he loved to send people back to themselves because they can often solve their problems. One of the problems is when you get overly dependent on somebody, you no longer think of yourself as being able to do it. The Rebbe also had a remarkable encounter with a very young man, 21-year-old man, came from a religious family in England, and he was visiting the United States. He was at Cambridge University. He was thinking either he wanted to study philosophy, or maybe law, or maybe economics. And though he had grown up and was still quite observant, he needed answers to questions. So he comes to the United States, and he manages to get a meeting with the Rebbe. His name was Jonathan Sachs. Sachs never became a Chabadnik also, but he always said that it was the Rebbe who was the main person who influenced him to become a rabbi. In the aftermath of that meeting with the Rebbe and other encounters with the Rebbe, Sachs recalls, he was 21 years old, and he's speaking to the Rebbe, and he says in passing, recently I found myself in a situation. And the Rebbe stopped him and said, he didn't like that expression, I found myself in a situation. He said it's an evasion of responsibility. One should say, rather, I placed myself in a situation. And the Rebbe continued, if you can place yourself in one situation, then you can place yourself in another situation. In other words, he empowered Sachs not to just see himself as passive, but as somebody who could affect things. Sachs said that in the aftermath of that comment to the Rebbe, he was never again able to make that excuse, I found myself in a situation, and believe it. He knew that there was more that he could do for himself. A third feature of the Rebbe. So we spoke so far of the unconditional love and of empowering people. A third feature of the Rebbe was an optimism about what human beings could accomplish, but tied into it was a very careful choosing of words. In my research, this was particularly interesting to me because for many years I have found the subject of words, how we use words, lashon hara, when we speak unfairly of others, onat devarim, when we speak unfairly to others. I've always been very fascinated by that whole subject, and I've always been struck every year when we start the Torah reading about how seriously the Torah takes words. Right at the beginning of Breshit, right at the beginning of Genesis, the first book of the Torah, Vayomer Elohim Yehi Or, and God said, let there be light. I would argue that, like God, we also create with words. And lest I seem to be exaggerating, think about it. Every one of you that I'm speaking to now has at some point in your life read a book that so moved you that there was a character in the book, and it could be a fictional book, a novel, that there could be a character in the book who you loved, you hated, you cried about, and yet that person never existed. A writer, through words alone, was able to create someone so real that it could evoke from you your deepest emotions. So obviously we need to be very, very careful in words and how we speak about words. The Rebbe was convinced that we often use negative words and they're harmful. Since I know you're all on mute, just raise your hands if you, by any chance, you know how to say the word for hospital in Hebrew. Any of you know the word for hospital in Hebrew? Okay, it's called okay, good. I see two people sitting together, both enthusiastically. Thank you. The word for hospital in Hebrew is Beit Cholim, which literally means the house of the sick. The Rebbe thought that there are people smiling at me there. Thank you. The Rebbe thought that was actually a very discouraging term. You're sending somebody to the house of the sick. So the Rebbe had a long-term campaign. He wanted hospitals to change their name to Beit Refuah, House of Healing. He said, this actually is accurate. The purpose of going to a hospital is to get better. So let people go in, with that feeling. I remember when I first learned this fact, that the Rebbe was upset with this term Beit Cholim. I remembered a conversation I had had with my mom many, many years ago when I was probably about 15. And I remember my mother telling me that when she was growing up, they used to have hospitals in New York called Home for the Incurables. Places for people who could never get better. And there were Jewish homes for the incurables. There were Catholic hospitals for the incurables. My mother said she's embarrassed, because when she told me this story, she was, a middle-aged woman. But she said she's embarrassed that as a young person, she didn't realize how horrible that sounded. Imagine going to a person's hospital room and say, oh, tomorrow we're moving you to the Home for the Incurables. It was awful. So that was the feeling the Rebbe had, because he thought that negative words really exert a negative influence. So the Rebbe, I think, in a way, anticipated a whole field of psychology that's called today positive psychology, that tries to enforce people and reinforce people with a positive way of speaking. And he actually made a real effort with hospitals in Israel to change that, and he affected a few. I'll give you another example of it. There's a term used in Hebrew, used for reasons that'll become obvious in a minute, primarily in Israel, called Nechei Tzahal. Nechei Tzahal literally means handicapped of the Israeli army. Tzahal is, of course, the name for the army in Israel. It's an acronym, Tzeva Haganah Yisrael, the Israeli Defense Army. And you can imagine in the aftermath of the Yom Kippur War, how many soldiers who did survive, but who suffered terrible injuries. And in 1976, the Israeli army decided to send some of these soldiers to the United States. Some of them, they wanted to consult doctors in the United States. Some of them to give these men who were suffering, were suffering, to give them a good time. But they also came to meet with the Rebbe. It was a very rare instance in which the Rebbe spoke to them and addressed them in Hebrew. The Rebbe overwhelmingly's public orations, the Rebbe knew many languages. We know of at least 7 languages that he comfortably spoke, which was very good. I mean, obviously, it's a rare talent. In the United States, it's really a rare talent. I know Europeans tend to know more languages than Americans. But the Rebbe, think about what he knew. Obviously, he grew up in a Yiddish-speaking home. He lived in Russia and actually took some classes before he left Russia in Russian universities. He then went to Germany, where he studied at university, and he then studied at university in France. Wait 1 second. And obviously he came to the United States and he learned Hebrew, and most obviously I left out the most obvious language he knew, which was of course Hebrew. So he used to give his speeches in Yiddish, On some occasions, when speaking to immigrants to the United States from Russia, he'd speak to them in Russian. And very rarely, but he would speak privately to people in Hebrew, but he wouldn't give speeches in Hebrew. But he addressed these soldiers in Hebrew. And all of these had been men who had been badly wounded in Israeli wars. And one of the things he said to them was, I know that in Israel they call you Nechei Tzahal, the handicapped of Tzahal. He says, but the truth is, as a rule, when people lose the ability of certain functions, they develop the ability to compensate. If you'd go online to Google and ask to see paintings that were done by people who couldn't paint with their fingers, they didn't have fingers, you will see remarkable paintings of people who paint with their toes. You know, there are remarkable things. We often hear that people who are blind develop more acute hearing. It's not that they necessarily hear things that other people can't hear, it's they know how to interpret sounds. So they will notice things. So the Rebbe said, you're sitting here and you're being defined there as handicapped, as if that definition describes you, but you are actually people who developed exceptional alternative abilities. They shouldn't call you Nechei Tzahal, they should call you Mitsuyanei Tzahal, the exceptional ones of Tzahal. And he then said, I would therefore be honored to shake every one of your hands because you have honored me by visiting me. And he then went over and spent time with every one of those soldiers. To gauge, to understand the striking nature of the language the Rebbe used, we should set this incident within its historical context. At that time, it was common to describe people who lost abilities in terms that could demoralize them. I remember once reading a biography of an American soldier who during World War II had lost both his arms, and he was in a military hospital. And then finally, when they were releasing him, the senior doctor at the hospital, gave a speech, what they sometimes call today in the United States, tough love. Tough love is when you love the person, but you're going to explain to them how hard their life's going to be. And so he said to these soon to be released soldiers, this year you're a hero. Next year you'll be what they call a disabled veteran. And after that, you're just going to be a cripple. That was the message with which he sent these people out into the world. Contrast that with the Rebbe's approach, you're exceptional. The Rebbe didn't like to use any negative words, and he actually changed me in this regard because I'm a writer, and when a writer has to get in something on time, so they'll say, what do they say? I'm working on a deadline. A deadline is a pretty terrible term. We all know what that means. If understood literally, it means like if you don't do it, you're dead. You got to get it in on time. So ever since then, I started saying due date. Due date is the date when a pregnant woman is told her child is due. So think about the difference between a deadline, which connotes death, and a due date, which connotes a new life coming into the world. In my book, I almost never used anonymous stories because you never know with an anonymous story if it's accurate or not. In a couple of rare instances, I did put in an anonymous story because there was an understandable reason why it would have been embarrassing for someone to reveal their name. But there is one anonymous story that I felt compelled to put in because it was so characteristic of the Rebbe, I'm sure it was true. A man came to see the Rebbe, and he was very pessimistic in everything that he was saying. And everything was hard for him. But what particularly bothered him was that he had raised his son to be a religiously observant Jew, and now his son basically was not observing Judaism. And finally, he sort of hit his hands in a gesture of despair. He says, you know what they say? He says, it's hard to be a Jew. It's a common expression. I find even American Jews, and I don't know if this is true in Europe, but I find even that American Jews who don't know Yiddish know that expression in English, Zer zu sein a Yid, it's hard to be a Jew. It's a known expression. So the Rebbe looked at the man and he said, I'm curious, do you often use that expression, Zer zu sein a Yid, it's hard to be a Jew? And the man said, yes, it is hard. So the Rebbe said to him, so then why are you so surprised that your son doesn't particularly want to be a Jew? Why don't you say something different? Why don't you say, sir, is gut zu sein a Yid? It's good to be a Jew. And you can start changing the whole attitude in your house. So many of us are not victims of lashon hara, of bad things that other people say about us, or of onas devarim, of bad things that other people say to us. We're also victims of bad words that we say to ourselves. If you go around saying it's hard to be a Jew, guess what? Every time you say it, it becomes harder. And if you think it's good, every time you say it, it becomes better. So that's why the Rebbe was so attached to the usage of optimistic language. Let me just give just a couple of other examples. I have one of the chapters in the book is how to, oh God, now I'm forgetting, I've lost myself in my notes. Give me 1 minute. How to disagree without becoming disagreeable. I know that political discourse in my country, in the United States, where I now live, has become terrible. Political discourse has become so severe that recent studies that have been done in the United States show that over 40% of Democrats think that hardcore Republicans are, quote, evil people, and over 40% of Republicans think that hardcore Democrats are evil people. 20% of Democrats think that if the Republicans died, the United States would become a better country. And 16% of Republicans think that if the Democrats all died, the country would become a better country. It was not that bad when I was growing up. And this sinah can be terrible. And we know that political discourse in Israel can get very bad as well. A rabbi, once wrote a very angry letter to the Rebbe. He disagreed profoundly with the position the Rebbe had taken. And he really wrote him in a very angry manner. And the Rebbe began his response to the man by saying, remember, there are 612 areas in which we agree. You know, obviously the Rebbe was metaphorically referring to the 613 commandments of the Torah. So even if they strongly disagreed on one of those issues, they had to remember that there were all these ways in which we agree. Every 4 years during the United States, when there's a presidential election, I will ask if I'm speaking to a politically liberal audience or a politically conservative audience, can you think of at least one reason somebody might be voting for the candidate you oppose that doesn't reflect badly on either their character or their intelligence? And people often cannot. I was speaking to Michal Seligson. Rabbi Seligson compiled a book. It weighs like 6 pounds. It's 1,600 pages. It indexes all the speeches that he had available at that time that the Rebbe had given throughout the over 40 years of his being a Rebbe. And he said one of the characteristic features is the Rebbe would never criticize by name. He would not attack people he disagreed with by name. He used to say, I don't speak about people, I speak about shitot. Shitot is the Hebrew word which means approaches. He will criticize different approaches, but he doesn't identify the person by name as if that's the only thing you need to know about that person. And I came across in my research, I don't have the time to go into it now because it would involve quite a lengthy discussion, people with whom he had very serious disagreements, but whom he never attacked by name. And he was then able to go to those people on other issues on which he shared goals with them. And he could ask them for their cooperation. He could ask them for their help. When you get to the level of what's going on today in the United States, where people in one party say terrible things about people in another party, you get to a point where they can't find other issues on which they really can cooperate because people are hurt when they're insulted. And so the Rebbe would say, I speak about shitot, I don't speak about people. And one last point I want to make, there's an expression, I don't know if you have the equivalent expression in the different languages in Europe. There's an expression that almost all kids I know, coming out of Jewish households, coming out of non-Jewish households, are familiar with. Parents will say to them, anything worth doing is worth doing well. The Rebbe's approach was a little different. I think what made Chabad very unusual is the Rebbe's approach was anything worth doing is worth doing now. There's a rabbi named Shapsi Katz. He was a rabbi in South Africa. He was a chaplain for the prisons in South Africa, and obviously most of the Jews who were in prisons in South Africa during the time of the apartheid regime were Jewish political prisoners. And he came to see the Rebbe, and the Rebbe, it was a day or two before Hanukkah, and the Rebbe said, how do they treat the prisoners in South Africa? Nobody will be surprised to know they were treated pretty badly. And apparently the government only recognized 3 Jewish holidays. They recognized Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, and Pesach. So Jews could be freed, from some of the forced labor on those days and other things. But the Rebbe said, do they recognize Hanukkah? And he said, no, they don't. The Rebbe said, do you know how important Hanukkah is as a holiday for a prisoner? Do you know that when somebody is living in the darkness of a prison, the power of lighting a candle? Rabbi Katz was so moved that he promised the Rebbe that for the following Hanukkah, he was going to do everything he could to influence the head chaplain of all the prisons to allow Jews to light Hanukkah candles. But the Rebbe said to him, that'll be very nice next Hanukkah, but what about this Hanukkah? So Rabbi Katz says, what can I do for this Hanukkah? It's in another, I think it might have even been the following day or 2 days later, and I'm here in Brooklyn. The Rebbe said to him, do you have the phone number of the head of the chaplains? And Katz conceded that he did. He said, why don't you give him a call right now? At the time he was speaking to the Rebbe, it was about 3 a.m. in South Africa. So he said, I can't call him at 3 a.m. The Rebbe said, that's even better. He'll definitely be home. And if you call him at 3 a.m, he'll definitely realize that it must be something very serious. You're not known to him as being a big pest. So Katz had to do what I suspect every single one of us would hate doing. Can you imagine calling up somebody who's your boss at 3 a.m? But he didn't have a choice. It was very hard to really just say no to the Rebbe. He called up the man, and the man actually agreed. He said, I'm sending out a teletype tomorrow to every prison in South Africa that Jewish prisoners should be allowed to light the Hanukkah candles. He came to understand it. So look, we looked at just a number of areas that we examined right now. And, what was the approach of the Rebbe and how did we do it? So first of all, we had the issue of this unconditional love, the story that happened with my father, or what he said to that girl who said, how can he say he loves me? He doesn't know who I am. And he said, how can he say he feels my pain? And he says, like a mother whose baby is crying because it's teething, that's kachani margisha tzarech. That's how I feel your pain. He empowered people. And when the young Jonathan Sachs said to him, what was it that Sachs said? He said, wait, I lost all my notes here. I recently found myself in a situation. He says, no, you placed yourself in a situation. He empowered him. He wanted to only use optimistic language and positive words. I stopped saying as a result, and a lot of people now stopped saying as a result deadline, which is demoralizing. He wanted to do it. The very notion that to try and minimize conflict, as the Rebbe put it, and the rabbi who attacked him in a letter, he said, we still have 612 areas in which we agree. Why can't we, when we have disagreements with people, also focus on the areas of agreement, which immediately takes away some of the sting of the disagreement? Otherwise, the disagreement becomes the defining feature in our relationship. And that very notion that anything worth doing is worth doing now. These are all teachings of the Rebbe that we can all incorporate, and they can massively start to change our lives. And these are all features in why the Rebbe became the dominant figure that he did. And I'll just add on very little, because I really have spoken longer than I was supposed to. But I'll just tell you one little minhag of the Rebbe that's not so widely known. In 1946, the Rebbe himself published very few books. There are enormous numbers of books now that were in effect by the Rebbe. He didn't write them, though. These are compilations of his speeches, and many of them he did manage to edit. But he wrote a book. He brought out a Haggadah in 1946. And he had a minhag, he had a custom, and it was clear that he wanted other people to practice this custom. Before a child recites the Manishtana, the 4 questions at the Seder, he always wanted the child to start by saying, Father, I will ask you 4 questions. And the Rebbe said, that's how you should start it, even if your father is no longer here living. Because he wanted that respect from door to door, from generation to generation. And in doing so, you help keep the spirit of your father alive. And I wish you all, as you get ready for Pesach now, that we're keeping it. Because, think about it. There are all these laws about Pesach, but when it comes to the Seder, almost all of us did not originally learn about the Seder from reading books of laws. We learned about it because we went to a Seder when we were children. And our parents learned about it when they went to a Seder when they were children. All Jews, all contemporary Jews, basically, with the exception, obviously, of converts who learned about it at the time that they were converting. But all other Jews basically learned about it in an unbroken tradition going back. As far as I can ascertain, the Seder is the longest standing ritual observed in the world, that's been observed continuously. So let me wish you all a Chag Kasher V'Sameach, a kosher Pesach, and a very, very happy Pesach. And I look forward one of these days to visiting all of you in your variety of countries. I know, is there anybody here from Denmark? I know, okay, I've had the zchus, I visited Denmark many years ago, probably due for another visit. I've been in England. I've been.
It's time we joined you. We had the honor of having you in Norway.
I would love.
We would love to have you.
That would be. Oh, good.
Thank you for this amazing evening. To hear all that together. Baruch Hashem, myself, who I was very fortunate to have been by the Rebbe quite many times as a child. My parents instilled this within us, and had my own responses and personal moments with the Rebbe, which I think, as you say, at the time I didn't even think of it as any big deal. It was obvious to me that, of course, as a 13-year-old or as a 16-year-old, if I'm going to write a letter to the Rebbe, of course he's going to answer me At the time, it was beyond me to even to try and get that. Looking back, I'm just I'm amazed, embarrassed, and altogether that this actually happened. We're going to take questions now. Anybody who has any questions, please type them up in the chat, and we'll be able to have the honor of hearing any responses to your questions. Oh, somebody wrote over here that they too from now on will follow the script writer and no longer use the word deadline, but due date, and he finds this to be a great lesson. So yeah, that is certainly.
Thank you.
That certainly is.
Thank you very much for telling me that. Thank you.
I remember hearing a Farbrengen at a Farbrengen of the Rebbe, and I remember till today. I'm excited today, but I remember at the time my excitement when the Rebbe was speaking was referring to the story of the destruction of the Second Temple, or I'm sorry, during the story of Hanukkah. And as we know, one of the tragic events that took place was that a pig was brought up as an offering. So the Talmud, the Gemara, refers to a pig rather than calling it a chazir, which has other connotations. The Talmud, and as well as later in other commentaries, call it a davar acher in Hebrew.
Oh, right.
Something else. And the Rebbe, in speaking, the thing that caught me off guard was that in the entire excitement of this amazing, beautiful vart and lesson that the Rebbe was learning, and the Rebbe suddenly said, and they offered a Dalet Aleph. And I'm like, Dalet Aleph? What's Dalet Aleph? Like, and I remember just chuckling to myself. The Talmud has already taken it from Chazir to Dover Acher, to something else. The Rebbe took it a step further. He didn't even say Dover Acher. He said Dalet Aleph, which are the first two letters of Dover Acher. So it's
Reb Shaul, I like that. Thank you.
So someone over here asks, what does the Rebbe mean to you? Thank you for an amazing talk.
The Rebbe, to me, symbolizes that we have an enormous capacity to make ourselves better than we were. And we're not the sort of people who, if we have a bad trait, stop struggling to overcome it or say, what can I do? I can't help it. You know, that's what his whole point was, that and that's what he inspires me with. Look, I'm inspired by his work ethic, and I don't think I could ever attain, the level of his work ethic. But the fact that somebody could do something makes us do more than we otherwise would have thought that we could do. And he had levels of love that I found remarkable. He could continue to have love even for people that I could not so easily love. So that's yet another feature of it.
You mentioned earlier about very beautifully, and thank you for that, about how to be able to disagree yet remain agreeable. And I think it's a very beautiful way, and it's so true of the Rebbe, because the Rebbe met many people who in their life, in their daily experience of life, didn't live anything like the Rebbe, and had strong arguments with the Rebbe, but yet were able to find a way. But it's perhaps a little more than that. How many times the Rebbe actually was pushing for something to happen in whether it was any type of Jewish leadership. The Rebbe wanted something to take place and explained its importance, and sometimes for not just by one word or one speech, etc., but sometimes for months, and we all know that some of these things years. And then when it didn't pull, I mean, you know, being today a rabbi and a community leader, I obviously can't compare, but there's the natural disappointment. You've tried, you've explained, you had people that understand the importance, and it didn't pull through. And somehow, as soon as the Rebbe heard that whatever he was pushing for sometimes for years, it didn't come through, he immediately jumped to the next project with the same people to try push something else through. And that's unbelievable. In other words, not only not to give up, but to sort of, okay, that didn't work. It was very important, but instead of saying, okay, I got no one to work with, find something that we can do together for the community. Although my original plan is out the window.
Yes, I think you're entirely right. Thank you. That's an important point.
Okay, you're having many very beautiful comments thanking you from Lapland, Finland, just to give you above the polar circle, or from all over, some very beautiful messages. But
if you could send them along, I'd love to see them.
Yeah, so I'll ask Rabbi Lowenthal from Denmark to later be able to send them along to you. But it's very special to hear this, especially tonight being the Rebbe's birthday, 119 years ago that the Rebbe was born.
Whoa, I didn't think about that. Yeah, next year is May of Estrom.
Yeah, it's Shnas Hamei of Estrom tonight, right? I mean,
we're
it's the 120th year tonight, and it's very special to be able to have you the honor of, and your book is, needless to say, amazing. I've given it as a gift to quite a few people here in Norway over the years. And it's an eye opener for many people who somehow are ambivalent and not sure what is this, what is Chabad, and what was the Rebbe's uniqueness to be able to do all this. And you've done a tremendous service for, if I may say, from Rebbe Malain to the Rebbe himself, to be able to bring his message and his persona to the public. I would be amiss not to mention again what Rabbi Lowenthal mentioned earlier, that the Rebbe would always encourage everyone to remember to sell their chametz before Pesach, regardless of the level of observance of Pesach itself. But selling the chametz, which takes literally 3 minutes online, is something that myself, my colleagues, all encourage everyone to do. Thank you for a wonderful talk. I've read your other books and will go and buy this one right away, writes Nancy Schletmo. Oh, from Norway. Perfect reading for the holiday week. There you go, Nancy. Chag Sameach to you. So, thank you again. Any other questions? Okay.
There's a couple more comments.
Yeah, go ahead.
It's not questions, but I see from Sweden, they've read how they read aloud from your book every week at the Chabad house, and their dream is to translate the book into Swedish.
Oh my God, I would love that.
That would be very nice. And you have many wishes. Then there's somebody that says, can you still join the saying? I guess that what they mean is, can you comment on the saying, if you save one person's life, you save the entire world? Does not sound so ambitious. I'm not quite sure what the question is, but just, I don't know, comment about that. And
another regards from Helsingborg, Sweden.
Okay.
yes,
Okay, you have many places to visit, Rabbi.
I look forward. God bless you. God
Yes.
bless you. Thank
So
you.
we wish everybody a wonderful Pesach, Chag Pesach Kosher V'Sameach, and thank everybody for joining us. And thank Rabbi Yosef for your beautiful presentation and talk,
Thank you.
and Rabbi Shaul for your mediating. And we'll hopefully meet soon in good times with celebration. And maybe, who knows, we'll even have the Pesach sacrifice this year in Jerusalem.
L'chaim. L'chaim to everyone. L'chaim and a good
L'chaim.
Yom Tov.
Chaim
Thank
and
you.
good Yom Tov, and should be good things. Thank
Amen.
you.
Thank you
Amen.
again.
Thanks,
Thank
Leah.
you very, very
Thank
much.
you so much. Thank you.